16th and 17th century. But before that, we are going to ask some questions about the previous lecture. So, first of all, I would like to ask you, what happened in 1660? Who can tell me the answer? I will give you two choices. It was the date of Restoration or the date of Romantic period, the start of Romantic period. Which one of these? Yes, that's right. So it's the date of Restoration. Another question I would like to ask you, what was the situation of theaters during the rule of Charles II? I will give you two choices. A, theaters were opened, or theaters were reopened. Which one of these two choices? Yes, that's the answer. So theaters were reopened during this age. Another question I would like to ask you, what was the relationship between writers and readers at that time? Tell me the relationship between writers and readers at that time. Can you tell me the relationship between them? We have many answers for this question. There was no money at that time for writers, or I can say few people who could read, or I can say no time for reading at that age. Another question I would like to ask you, how many political groups were there at that time? We have three answers. I will give you three choices. So, we have two groups, the Whig and the Tory, or the Labour and the Whig, or we can say the Whig and the Tory is the best answer, and it is the right answer, yes. Another question I would like to ask you, why was it called the Glorious Revolution? Why was it called Glorious Revolution? Who can tell me the answer? It was glorious because there was a lot of blood, or no bloodshed at that time. There was no bloodshed at that time. Which answer is the right answer? A or B? Yes, that's the answer. Because there was no bloodshed at that time. Another question, why is 1798 important in literature? Who can tell me the answer? Yes, that's right. It was the date of Romantic, or the start of Romantic period. So these are some questions about the previous lecture I would like to explain for you. Now let's start with today's lecture. Today we are going to talk about the changes that happened during the 17th and 18th century. Let's start with today's lecture. Let's start with a brief introduction about the features or the changes that happened during the 17th and 18th century. The main features or changes of the 18th century, and you remember that we call the 18th century the Age of Reason or Enlightenment age. Almost each one in this age tried to build his intense individualism. So it was very important to focus on this aspect of this age. We have individualism, and we are going to talk about this in the aspects of the novel later in the second lecture. Therefore, there was a need for literary works that embody this characteristic. People began to read a lot because of a printing and spread of newspapers. So, if I asked you this question, why did people start to read a lot? We have the answer in this. We have, there was a need for literary works that embody this characteristic. People began to read, this is the answer. People began to read a lot because of a printing and spread of newspapers. Because of these changes in the 18th century, more reading public appeared and made an audience for the English novel. And we are going to talk about this feature in the following lecture also. So we are going to focus on this since it was related to English novel. So we have expected readers. All of these changes led to the rise of the novel in some way or another. Now let's see the first change. We have a change in freedom. There was a belief in human ability to achieve what he wanted, the person or the human being, what he wanted without giving instructions by anyone or even by the church at that time. So he was free to some extent. Another change, we have rational thinking. It became possible to apply rational laws to describe social and physical behavior. So knowledge could be used in everyday life. Let's focus on this. So we have rational thinking. They started to think about everything around them. So it became possible to apply rational laws to describe social and physical behavior. So knowledge could be used in everyday life, and we have great scientists appeared during this age. Another change, we have spread of education. A human being is naturally good and can be educated to be better. Reason was the key to truth through education, whereas in the previous ages, religion, the church, relied on blind faith, not allowing any other authority, not questionable. So I would like to explain this better. So we have spread of education. We have more writers, we have more readers, and we have more books at that time. So reason was the key to truth through education, whereas in the previous ages we don't have writers of novels and we don't have readers, especially readers. Material change. There was a change in materialistic attitude. Most thinkers attacked the Catholic Church. Most people began to be interested in material rather than religion. Many people turned against the church and withdrew from religious belief. So secular values gained ground. So we have a change in financial situation. Most of the people interested in materialistic attitude. Another change, we have scientific change. Most people were no more interested in the supernatural, but in the normal. Again, we have in this change, most people were no more interested in the supernatural, but in the normal. Technological achievements appeared in this age through scientific methods such as observation, experimentation, and hypothesis. There were no scientific discoveries before. So we didn't have any discovery before that time, which is very important to that age. There were few discoveries before in the age of 17th century. City migration. A lot of people moved from the country village to the town city, because cities were very important at that time, and a lot of writers, readers, industry, all these facilities existed in the city, not the village. The village was far away from development. We have another change, agriculture. We have that change in agriculture or agricultural change. During the previous ages, people used old methods and techniques in agriculture. Even they didn't grow some kinds of groups because of illogical thinking. So we have a spread of agriculture everywhere at that time, and we will see example on this. For example, they didn't grow potato. Why? Because they thought it was the cause of diseases and plagues. Look at this. It's a trivial reason to not grow potato at that time. So if I ask you, why didn't people grow potato in the 17th century? The answer would be like this: because they thought it was the cause of diseases and plagues. And if I ask you another question, what was the reason behind that? Since it was not mentioned in the Bible, it was no good for human being. So, since it was not mentioned in the Bible, this kind of vegetable was not good for a human being. What do you think of that? Try to compare this with our day. Another change, we have social change. Social life developed increasingly. There were coffee houses almost all over of England where people met and interacted with each other. So we have a lot of coffee houses at that time in the 18th century. In this situation, novelists became closer to normal human nature and everyday life. It became exposed and reachable. So we have a lot of coffee houses at that time, so people can meet together and can do a lot of things together, like reading for each other or listening to each other at that time. Diversity. In the previous ages, there was no way of diversity, so we have a lot of opinions about this. So diversity in the previous ages, there was no way of diversity, somehow closed-minded attitude. In the age of reason, there was acceptance of other ideas and other cultures. So we have many ideas from other cultures, like French culture. We have a lot of ideas, philosophical ideas from French culture. Family life. There was another change in the family life. Family life was gradually changed. There was more respect and equality in dealing with women and children during this age. There was a new outlook towards family life in general. In this age, even the parents began to give different names for their newborn babies to achieve their individuality. So it's a kind of related in some way or another to individualism, to achieve individualism, and we are going to explain this in details in the following lectures, especially in the aspects of the novel or the reasons behind the rise of the novel. So again, we have family life. It was gradually changed. We have a change in the family life. There was more respect. So children and parents, we have more respect and equality in dealing with women. We have more respect for women and more respect for children. There was a new outlook towards family life in general. In this age again, even the parents began to give different names for their newborn babies. To achieve what? To achieve individualism. Even the classes of society had changed according to Daniel Defoe. So we have another classification of classes in the society. Before we have at least, we have 1 or 2 or 3 classes. Now we have more than 7 classes at that age. There were 7 classes of people in the 18th century. Before we have high class or the noble class, and we have middle class and the poor. Only 3 classes, around 3 classes. Now we have more than that in the classification of classes. We have the first one, the great. This class, or the people in this class, lived lavish life. The second one, we have the rich, who live very plentifully. They have a lot of money and they are luxurious in some way or another. The third class, we have the middle sort, who live well. 4, we have the working traders or trades, who labor hard but feel no want. So they labor hard, they work a lot, but they get enough money for them. 5, the country people, farmers, etc., who fare indifferently, so they have their livings around their livings only, so they had to work in order to live. And we have 6, the poor, that fare hard. They found that it was very difficult to live, except they have to find their living from rich and other classes in order to live. This class is the poor. The miserable that really suffer want. And we have lower than that, lower than the poor, we have the miserable. Another change, we have political change. Political stability and years of peace in England resulted into an economic prosperity that led to the emerging of the middle class. You remember the rule of George I, George II, George III in the 18th century. We have talked about this in the first lecture, and we said that political stability, and we have a lot of these features in the 18th century. People improved their financial situation based on individual achievement rather than depending on father's position, hereditary right. So again, we have political change. We have more stable political change at that time. Everything was stable, and we have a lot of political ideas in the 18th century. And we can sense that in their writings. During the 17th and 18th centuries, there were important revolutions in England and its surrounding countries or areas. They affected the rise of the novel, and they were the main topic of a lot of many novels. These revolutions are. So, we have a lot of revolutions, but we are going to talk about only 4 important revolutions at that time. We are going to start with a revolution that began in the 17th century. You remember that revolution? It was the Glorious Revolution. So, we have the Glorious Revolution in England. This is the first revolution. The second one, we have the American Revolution. The third one, we have the French Revolution. And the fourth one, we have the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk about the Glorious Revolution and have more focus on this revolution. The Glorious Revolution, it happened in 1688. The Glorious Revolution was also called the Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange took the English throne from James II in 1688. William of Orange gathered 21,000 soldiers and sailors and set sail for England. So we have 21,000 soldiers and sailors and set sail towards England. It was bloodless revolution because few battles took place on English soil. You remember we had a question on this. Why was it called glorious? Because there was no bloodshed at that time. James II left England to France. According to a well-known historian, Berkey, the events of 1688 and 89 were a happy and glorious revolution. It was a tradition from illegitimate or transition. It was a transition from illegitimate control to legitimate one. The goals or the purposes of this glorious revolution or the aims, it aimed at the first one or the first goal, to get rid of James II and his injustice. The second one, we have political and social settlement. We have political stability and social justice. Now let's talk about the American Revolution. The American Revolution, this is the second kind of revolution or the second one of revolutions. It started in 1775 and ended in 1783. During the last decades of 18th century, 13 colonies in North America joined together to free themselves from the control of England and became the United States of America. So this is the beginning of the American Revolution. This revolution, as we said, or war, we can call it a war, began in 1774-5 and ended in 1783. Now let's see the aims or the goals of this revolution. The first goal of the American Revolution, again, we have number one, or the first goal, independence. So they free themselves from England or the English Empire, so they became independent, they can control themselves. The second one, we have freedom. We have more freedom among the people or the American people at that time. Equality, since we have a lot of cultural backgrounds in America, we have some people who came from Africa, Asia, other countries to settle in America. We have equal rights for all of them. This is the goal of the American Revolution. Also, we have equality, equal rights. Now let's see the French Revolution. It began in 1789 and ended in 1799. So it took around 10 years, yes. It was against injustice and inequality. During the first years of the revolution, many poor people and farmers attacked rich people by breaking into their houses. So at the beginning of this revolution, we have a lot of vandalism. They stole and killed them. That time was called the Great Fear. If I ask you this question, why was it called the Great Fear? Why was the French Revolution at its beginning was called the Great Fear? The revolution ended when Napoleon Bonaparte took power in 1799. So again, if I want to answer this question again, we have to say that many people or many poor people and farmers attacked rich people by breaking into their houses. They stole and killed them. So there were a lot of killing and stealing at that time, or robbery at that time. So it was called the Age or the Great Fear. After around 10 years of instability, the new France was finally formed, inspired by the American Revolution. This is very important. So the French Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution. America had already founded a democratic system, so the French underwent the same experience. So the French Revolution was similar in some way or another to the American Revolution. The aims or the goals of the French Revolution, it aimed at, as it was said in the revolution's slogan, we have a slogan of this revolution. The first goal, we have liberty. The second goal, we have equality. And the third goal, we have fraternity. Liberty, you know, liberal things, a kind of freedom. Equality, equal rights between people. Fraternity, if I ask you, what's the meaning of fraternity? So we have the meaning of fraternity. Yes, that's right. So we can make groups or surrounding people around each other, friends together. So it's the right to gather with themselves or to be in groups together. So fraternity, we can say a group of people who share the same ideas, the same work, the same relationship. So we can say, for example, We have medical fraternity. Since they have the same job, they can put together in order to make fraternity or medical fraternity. These values inspired novelists at that time. Now let's see the Industrial Revolution. It started around 1760 and ended around 1840 or 1820. The Industrial Revolution was the transition to new methods of manufacture in the period from about 1760 to sometime between 1820 and 1840. This transition included going from hand production methods to machines, a new chemical industry, iron production, the increasing use of steam power, and the development of machine tools. So these are the achievements of Industrial Revolution. So we have what? Chemical industry, iron production, and the increasing use of steam power. So we have steam power, which was used in train, and the development of machine tools. These are the achievements of Industrial Revolution. Now let's see, or let's have a look on the other side of Industrial Revolution. We had bad or negative effects of the Industrial Revolution. The first one, we have air pollution. So we didn't have clean air at that time. The second one, we have spread of diseases all over the areas. And we have materialistic interest. So we have materialistic interest over religious interest at that time. Also, we have another bad effect. We have the work of children at that time. Below the age of 16 or 18, we had a lot of children who worked at that time. Let's see the other side. We have good or positive effects of the Industrial Revolutions. We have the first one, transportation became easier since we have steam power and we had trains at that time. The second one, we have mass production. As a result of Industrial Revolution, we have, until this time, we have mass production because of industry. The third one, we have spread of printing and press, and we are going to see this and its reflection on the rise of the novel. Spread of printing and press. It also included the change from wood and other biofuels to coal. It began in England and within a few decades had spread to other countries in Europe and America. So we have the spread of Industrial Revolution all over the world. It changed the life of people since they were interested in agriculture using simple methods. Machines changed their lives upside down. Now let's see. All revolutions of that time focused on individualism. So the most important aspect of revolutions was individualism. England became a great powerful empire. It expanded overseas and led to the first one, we have growth of trade. Internal and external increased manufacturing. The economy began to escalate toward Industrial Revolution again. Better food supplies. There were better food supplies at that time. More people survived. Growing number of population. So we had more people at that time surviving because we had a lot of developments. On the other hand, some critics saw that negatively. Rising prosperity in England was built on inhumanity overseas. England's expansion into empire was a result of enslaving poor nations and their lands. All these features and changes happened in the 18th century affected the rise of the English novel directly or indirectly. This will be clear in the coming lectures. Thank you so much. See you next lecture.